is increasingly pertinent to confront Africa's leadership challenges, that we might renegotiate her place in the global configuration of our world. Fanon did say, in his psychopathology of colonialism, he argues that colonialism inflicted deep psychological wounds that led to an internalized sense of racism and a displacement of identity, which also adds to distress. Professor Wole Soyinka's work invites us to reclaim that identity by locating the individual within the context of his own cultural context and encouraging us to embrace our own cultural heritage through his work, his extensive work over the years. So you might argue that he didn't write or speak directly to post-colonial conceptual frameworks, but I would argue otherwise, because fundamentally at the base of his work is that we locate the individual within the context of his African cultural society and thus reclaim our own cultural identity, which arguably was fractured through the colonial experience. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would have you know that among us leadership scholars, there's an age-old contention about the essence of leadership and conceptually speaking of what leadership really is. In my earlier treatise in 2013, I attempted the dilemma of defining leadership. So what this means is that as far as we academics are concerned, there is no one universal definition of leadership. Indeed, on this we have all agreed to disagree. But there is also another thing on which we all seem to agree. And this is that leadership means different things to different people. If this is the case, then it might make you wonder, what are all these executive global leadership development programs about? When we see something as a global leadership development program, leadership education by whom and for whom? Leadership development by whom and to whose standard? So to borrow from the Holy Scriptures, I invite you to come, let us reason together over the next 10 minutes or so. So within the domain of this executive education, the concept of leadership is an increasingly romanticized one. When we say leadership development, more often than not, images of executive travel, luxury retreats, fancy hotels, and of course, world-class experts delivering high-end interventions come to mind, with management gurus and leadership gurus flown all across the globe, so to impart leadership knowledge to us. But the accepted approach taught in the majority of these programs across the globe fails to address one important issue. Business and social culture around the world is diverse. And therefore, a universal one-size-fits-all approach to leadership development or leadership understanding is flawed because it ignores two fundamental truths which empirical research brings to light. First, the universal approach glosses over the fact that leadership is first and foremost a social construct rather than a scientific phenomenon. You might argue otherwise, but leadership knowledge, what we know about leadership, is constructed in and through the context of human interaction. So it's, after all, about leading people. Human beings are not static or isolated, but rather they can be seen as social actors, entrenched in a dynamic social reality that is always moving, within which they draw, within which they base their perceptions, their actions, their interactions, and their sense of meaning. Therefore, whatever knowledge we might have about leadership has been developed within a wider framework of human interaction, which will be diverse across different cultures. Secondly, not only is leadership socially constructed, just like I have described, it's also contextual. We know that human interaction in exchange and understandings of things occur in the context of society. And society is a social, culturally bounded space in which people find themselves. This social context itself is governed by cultural forces, meaning that leadership knowledge developed by anybody, be they practitioners, educators, artists, whatever, around the world will be developed within a culturally influenced context. So knowledge about leadership is not absolute. It's not objective. It's not universal, but it's more subjective and far more culturally contingent than we think or than we realize. So with these two things in mind, it is clear that leadership is socially constructed, contextual, and culturally contingent. Where am I going with this? Stay with me. So the rich and diverse continent that is Africa gives a real example of the need for contextually sensitive and a culturally aware approach to building leadership capacity. So far, contemporary practice has continued to assume a universal understanding. You hear things like transformational leadership, charismatic leadership, and they're all good things. But the real issue is that what we have come to embrace about mainstream leadership theory and practice is anything but mainstream. You see why? As you look more closely, you will observe that these perspectives are really Western hegemonic thought formations discursively privileged as mainstream. But another pertinent question is, why is it so? Given that leadership cannot be universally defined because it is grounded in the vast sociocultural experiences that shape our reality, so that it means different things to different people, the question is, what leadership are we developing in others? By whom? For what? And why is it privileged as mainstream? You will find the same parallel in medicine. Mainstream medicine versus alternative medicine. Who named it so and why? Do they or do they not work? Whose one is mainstream? Which one is alternative? Alternative to whose one? In the next few minutes, I'll attempt to answer these questions for you. So, management educators will agree that most of the voices that shape our leadership understanding today arise from the Anglo-American scholarship belt. So, for example, I just mentioned nice ones like highly intuitively appealing ones like transformational leadership, situational contingency models, charismatic servant leadership, authentic leadership. The list goes on and on. So, indeed, not only has much of the modern published discourse on leadership originated primarily from the West, but to date, contemporary leadership development, management education, even in African business schools, has remained predominantly structured around this. Western thought leadership has become more or less the canon. And I'm not saying everything West is bad, like my brother Professor Winston pointed out. But the issue is how we adapt what we take in. And the argument is that we shouldn't adapt this uncritically. I make bold to say that given the fact that mainstream leadership we mostly teach and attempt to practice globally, is today dominated by Western scholarly thought, it is little wonder that African societies have continued to flounder in leadership mediocrity as they attempt to practice Western functionalist paradigms of leadership that are usually devoid of soul, and this is no disrespect, stripped of African identities, and that have failed woefully to account for its unique contextual experiences. Having said that, we must also begin to look at the political processes that powered the mainstreaming of a particular worldview over others. It is no secret that the colonial experience was as ideologically and epistemically violent as it was economically and politically so. Whole identities, we know the story, customs, ways of being were inferiorized through the civilizing patterns of thought, including the use of words like primitive, barbaric, and which continue to be echoed by us even today with denigrating expressions such as Bushman. Ancient civilizations tried and tested were not only inferiorized by that experience, so that we struggle post-colonially, speaking chronologically, and also speaking with a sense of what time we are in now. We're in a post-colonial time, and that's another thank you to Professor Winston for helping us open that up a bit. So ancient civilizations tried and tested were not only inferiorized by that experience, but were substituted by the civilizers' ways of being. Only that these ways of being were not given to us as company, they were sub-contrived for African society, such that it produced neither fish nor fowl. As such, whole societies and sociocultural frameworks were systematically stripped and erased on the back of colonial power and authority. So the colonial project was covertly clear in its aims: to degrade, to dispossess, and to replace. what I long ago termed to inferiorize. So what has, however, emerged in this age, in the post-colonial age, long after the exit of master, are the ideologically grotesque forms of reality that we are now all having to grapple with. It is said, and again I quote Fanon, and by extension, Professor Wole Soyinka, in his attempt to reclaim African identity, said the ultimate success, according to the psychopathology of colonialism, the ultimate success of the civilizing colonial project was to so thoroughly inferiorize and undermine the colonial subject until he finally turned on himself. In turning from himself, then he will understand the white man's burden and cooperate with the latter's attempt to civilize him, seeing that there was nothing civilized about him. This is especially so in the young would-be leaders. How many of us still carry this burden today and interactively and discursively echo the very same sentiments? We denigrate our own accents. I'm speaking to younger people, sorry. At school, we smirk at that new kid and say things like, fresh off the boat. We do everything to distance ourselves from origin point and refer to our Nigerian mom as crazy, who shouts too much. What you must ask yourself at this point is, how did I become such a successful colonial project? With respect to leadership, it has become increasingly pertinent to address this issue. We simply cannot have successful colonial projects masquerading as African leaders, tied to the apron strings of colonial thought formations and civilizing ways of being. Leadership is contextual, culturally contingent, and this means that leadership practice cannot be divorced from the specific sociocultural context within which it occurs. It must thus begin to make contextual sense to those who will practice it in the social context in which they will be practicing as leaders. This is a very significant issue for the development of leadership capacity in Africa, whether as technocrats, whether as executives, whether as artists, within this culturally heterogeneous continent. Global leadership development programs or leadership development in any capacity cannot must fundamentally account for the local frameworks within which they are applied. They cannot anymore ignore the cultural terrain, and they must be held rigorously to account for them. I believe that this is essential, if not urgently critical, to effective capacity building in Africa across the diversity of cultures worldwide. It is unwise to continue to import value-laden, prepackaged learning interventions in a bid to superimpose it on our local societies. Instead, contemporary leadership practice development in diverse regions such as Africa must begin to embrace and embody the key cultural elements of that society in order to be truly effective. What am I saying as I close? Leadership development, leadership capacity building must begin to make contextual sense to its recipients and to the social context in which they will be practicing.